Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
In 1989, my wife and I were newlyweds. At the time, we were looking to buy a house here in the Spokane, Washington area. While being shown the basement of a Victorian-style house, we were shown a corner that had been excavated. As I looked in, I saw a large black dog leap toward me and jumped back. The dog did not appear further. Later, while back in the living room, we were talking about some unrelated matters, and I looked at the heating vent, old-fashioned decorative ironwork grill about a foot square, as I recall due to some movement. I saw a small, furry man looking out at us. His hands were holding onto the grillwork. When he noticed me looking, he quickly let go and vanished into the heating vent. I alerted the others, but none of them saw it. Shortly afterward, I saw a ghostly figure of a woman in a blue dress in the corner of the room. Again, none of the others saw the apparition, but before I described the phantom woman, the person who lived in the house asked me if she looked like so-and-so. Details of the specter's appearance escape me now, beyond the blue dress, which matched precisely what I had seen. She explained that the figure had appeared several times previously. She was not aware of small furry men, however, and the dog was similarly unknown to her. I do not know if the three appearances were connected beyond occurring in the same general period of time. The first, the black dog, was about the size of a German shepherd, of indeterminate breed, but vaguely wolf-like. It was aggressive when it leapt at me. The next appeared to be a small man-like figure covered in dark brown fur or thick hair, about 10 inches tall, perhaps, but hunched over slightly. The last, if it was a fairy, appeared to be an adult-sized woman whom I recall as very beautiful, though the details of her face and appearance have been lost to my memory. Similarly, the dog is somewhat vague to my recollection, though no more so than other memories from that era. The small man, however, is vividly marked in my memory. I can easily call up the texture of his fur, hair, the color of his fur, the appearance of his face, and so on. Because of the strange and unexplained activity, we decided not to buy the house. We did purchase a home nearby, 5 houses away on the same side of the street. We still reside there. I occasionally wonder if those entities still inhabit the house.
What you are about to read is a true story. This is a genuine case that took place many years ago. It really did happen to me and my family, and I would like to share it with you as my story needs to be told. My family and I lived at a large property called Gladstone Villa in the former mining town of Bargoed in the Caerphilly County Borough of South Wales throughout the 1970s. We experienced many unusual phenomena that simply defied any rational explanation, like footsteps in the main bedroom that would be heard on a regular basis, mainly in the evening, but sometimes during the day when we would all be sat downstairs watching television. One of us would turn the volume down to hear the footsteps more clearly. We also had some minor poltergeist activity. I witnessed electrical cables being pulled by unseen forces from upstairs, and my grandfather said he had a glass bottle thrown towards him as he entered the main bedroom, just missing him. I saw him with the broken glass in his hand as he told us. There was also the occasional sighting, so rare in fact that in all the years I was living at Gladstone Villa I didn't see any manifestations or apparitions, but my mother saw it on at least 3 occasions, as well as my grandfather. There were 4 family members that lived at Gladstone Villa: my maternal grandparents William and Rita Higgs. William, who preferred to be known as Bill to his family and friends, was a former miner who worked at Bargoed Colliery in the 1950s. Then there were my parents, Douglas and Caroline Dexter. They met at the Bake House in Baldwin Street in Bargoed. They dated for 3 years before they married on April 1, 1968 at 2 p.m., so it wasn't such a foolish thing to do after all, but the Beatles were number 1 in the charts with Lady Madonna. Very appropriate. They didn't get a place of their own. They stayed at Gladstone Villa with my grandparents Bill and Rita, and I was born in the August of 1969, and it was soon after that my mother told me that the strange activity began. My mother said it all started off rather quietly, with little taps here and there, but hardly noticeable, nothing to be too concerned about. It didn't take long for the activity to increase. I was still a baby at the time it all started in the summer of 1969, so my mother told me about how it got worse. She said the family heard what sounded like somebody jumping down from the attic and onto the landing floor. Naturally, thinking this was somebody trying to break in, they went to see what was going on. When they got upstairs they found nothing. Nobody was to be seen, but they found the hatch to the attic was open. Very curious indeed. Whatever it eventually occupied itself in the main bedroom, which incidentally belonged to my grandparents Bill and Rita, and it didn't take long for the spirit to make its presence felt. May and evening footsteps could be heard walking around the room. There were typical signs of poltergeist activity. When I was still a baby, my mother said she checked my cot and she saw that the pillow was torn right in half. I don't think I was in it at the time. Another occasion, the family went out for the day. When they got back, they found that the furniture in the living room had been turned upside down. There were no signs of a break-in and nothing was missing, no forced entries. One evening, my mother went into the main bedroom to get my father up for the night shift at the bake house. She saw that his slippers were thrown out onto the landing, but more was to come. When she went inside, she saw that the ironing board was carefully placed on my father's torso as he slept. When she managed to wake him and he came to, he was astonished to see the situation he was in. My father Douglas was quite suspicious of my grandfather Bill, thinking that it was my grandfather doing it, but as time passed he realized it wasn't him doing it at all, and he became convinced this was a genuine haunting. At some point Bargoed police were involved for some reason. They checked the attic but found nothing, but they suspected that it was my father Douglas playing pranks on the family from the bake house. My parents separated and my father left Gladstone Villa sometime in 1972, but it wasn't because of what was going on at the property, it was just a breakdown of the marriage. I have no memory of my dad living at Gladstone Villa at all, but he would come to see me every Saturday to take me to places. I enjoyed going to the Cameo Cinema in Bargoed with him. They finally divorced on the 25th of April 1975. The famous Scottish group at the time were the Bay City Rollers, and they were number 1 on the British charts with Bye Bye Baby, again, very appropriate and almost amusing in this sad situation. As I got older, I experienced the phenomena for myself. I too heard all the footsteps in the main bedroom. I remember my grandfather Bill looking up to the ceiling and pointing up, trying to point out just exactly where the footsteps were coming from. He would say, "He's by there," and "He's by here now." I also witnessed the electrical cables being pulled from the television, and my grandfather Bill would be angry just in case it caused any serious damage. The activity got so bad that we slept downstairs with the lights on all night as we were too scared to sleep upstairs. Only my grandfather Bill slept in that room. He was the only one who was supposedly brave enough, but my grandmother Rita knew that he was just as scared because every time he would go upstairs he would whistle a tune. My grandfather Bill claimed to have had an unpleasant experience in that room. One night he was alone there, when all of a sudden he said he felt a presence there, heard what sounded like floorboards creaking by the door, then he was paralyzed on the bed. He just couldn't move, not even shout out to call us to help him. I too also had an unpleasant experience while alone in that room. I still remember it well. The bedroom light was on as I was scared of the dark. It was very quiet. I was lying on my left-hand side facing the window that overlooked the street we lived in, Cardiff Road, when all of a sudden I felt something pounce on the bed. I heard the bed springs going just once. I was naturally too scared to look straight away, being a child at the time, but when I did eventually look, there was nothing there at all. I went downstairs to tell my mother and my grandparents, and they came up to see what was going on. When we got there we saw 3 distinctive paw marks, that of an animal. It never happened again. Mrs. Ivy France was a family friend, more of a friend to my grandmother Rita. She was well in her 50s by the 1970s, and she enjoyed a game of bingo at the old people hall next to Gladstone Villa. She used to read the tea leaves from the cup but was rather skeptical when my grandmother told her Gladstone Villa was haunted. I still remember Ivy now going up into the main bedroom, looking around, and saying it was the vibration from the traffic outside on the main road causing it, but her opinion was soon to change when she experienced it for herself when she visited one evening. It was then the local press was suggested, but my grandmother Rita quickly declined for fear of ridicule. But then a local medium was suggested, one that Ivy France knew of. His name was John Matthews. When John Matthews arrived, he started by asking the family questions. Then he began by challenging the spirit to perform by knocking on the ceiling, and the entity immediately knocked back at him. At some point the medium John went into a trance to try and make contact with it. He failed to get a name, but he later confirmed the obvious, that there was indeed a presence there, and it was an earthbound spirit. A priest by the name of Graham Jones was also called to Gladstone Villa. He blessed the property, and after a few prayers he duly left, and it was quiet for a few short months after that, but the activity returned. The footsteps continued as well, that the noises and bangs and sounds of dragging, only this time it started to show itself. One night we were watching television when my mother Caroline just so happened to look to her left to where my grandmother was reading a book when she saw the full solid figure of a monk standing behind the sofa that my grandmother was on, near the doorway. My grandfather and I didn't see it as we were watching television, but she later described what she saw in detail, which was a monk, with typical brown habit, complete with hood over the head so she didn't see his face. She said it was there for a few moments and it was gone. There was another sighting, but this took place in the daytime. My mother and I were in the front room. When my mother went over to the sofa to get something, she looked to her left and I saw the confused expression on her face. I didn't see this as I was behind the door that was wide open, obscuring the hallway, but she later told me that she saw the face of an elderly man with a shock of white wavy hair looking into the room from the hallway that led up to the bedroom. Fred Davies was another family friend. He was my grandfather Bill's workmate from Bargoed Colliery. Fred was a tall, slim man who would always wear a flat cap and glasses and smoked homemade cigarettes which he kept in his mouth as he spoke to us. Every time he would visit he would sit in his favorite chair by the open fire. One day he came up, it was quiet, I was playing by the sideboard quite happily when all of a sudden there was a very loud bang, just once. It was so loud that it made Fred duck his head and I ran to my mother Caroline for safety. When it was all quiet again we all went upstairs to see what had happened. My grandfather Bill would be the first to go and I would be last. When we got there we could not find anything that could account for that one loud bang. Fred later told us that he ducked his head because he thought it was going to come through the ceiling. It was like someone had dropped a large heavy trunk. My grandfather Bill always liked to look out the landing window over the street of Cardiff Road, facing Bargoed Town Centre. On this occasion Fred Davies joined him. He said he felt some brush pass him. When he looked there was nothing there. We had the ghost for so long that my grandmother Rita gave it a nickname. She called it Johnny. My grandfather Bill would mock it by shouting out that name to get a reaction, but nothing would happen. Every time my grandmother would watch the TV show, Songs of Praise, on the Sunday, Johnny would start, as if he would take any exception to religious music being played. The same thing would happen when my grandfather Bill would play his records and LPs, particularly the 70s band, Slade. One occasion, my granddad Bill played their album, Old New Borrowed and Blue, from 1974 in the bedroom. Johnny would turn the electric off. This would annoy my granddad Bill. Yet another family friend, Derek, would also come to experience the phenomena. One night Derek came up to paint the living room door green for us. My mother was cooking sausages in the kitchen when the noises would start. This would quite naturally frighten Derek into stopping for a while until the noises stopped, but Derek was determined to finish the job he had started and he did so. Both my mother and grandfather once claimed to have heard a baby crying there in the main bedroom, but as I didn't hear this at the time I took very little notice of this. We left Gladstone Villa in the summer of 1978 when two local businesses by the name of John and Aldo Ricci bought the property and the name was changed to Park Villas when John's son moved in, but he made no claims that the property was haunted. Curious. It was eventually converted into a hotel and the name was changed again to the Park Hotel. The then proprietor was a Londoner by the name of Roland Butler, but he also made no claim that the place was haunted. It wasn't until new management took over that rumors surfaced that it was actually haunted. The name was changed again to Reds when the McBurney family took over. On our last night at Gladstone Villa, we still experienced things. Our belongings were packed in black plastic bin bags in the hallway. We were getting ready to settle down for the night, ready for the big move the next day. The lights were on. My granddad Bill was upstairs when it all started up again. We heard the bags in the hallway being thrown around, then the old-fashioned rounded door knob was being turned, as if someone was trying to get in, but it didn't. This frightened my mother so that she called out to my grandmother Rita in panic. I had my 40th birthday in August of 2009 at Reds Park Hotel for old time's sake, and it was the staff who told me of their own personal experiences, particularly the barmaid Debbie. They said there were sightings in the bar and in room 5, footsteps and an eerie feeling, and they didn't like going down to the cellar as they heard noises down there, especially Debbie's husband Neil, who thought someone was trying to break in. I did some research into the history of the property and the whole of the Cardiff Road area, and I found out some very interesting things indeed. I discovered from local newspaper archives and Bargoed Library that Gladstone Villa dates back to the 1900s. I found out that a family lived there in 1924, the Kimmitt family. Their baby son Elvin Rollins Kimmitt died at Gladstone Villa in 1924. He was just 4 months old, according to the family notices of the South Wales Echo of that year. This explains the baby my mother and my grandfather heard. Makes sense now. The Jones family lived there during the Second World War. I discovered a letter written by Henry Jones from Gladstone Villa. His son was taken prisoner. The Mills family were also there at some point, and Edgar Mills also claimed that Gladstone Villa was haunted. Maybe this was the old man my mother saw. I also discovered that there was also a monastery in Baldwin Street, where my parents worked. This explains the monk my mother saw, and a priest hide is said to be in an old listed building that dates back to the 17th century that has tunnels leading up to the local villages of Gallagher, where there is a church called St. Catwoops, and Nelson, where there is an old manor house called Langcake Manor, which is well known to be haunted and was featured in Most Haunted. It was once owned by the Pritchard family. What I have said here is the truth, and I wouldn't share this if I couldn't possibly back this up, and I challenge any hardened skeptic to stay there. I can assure them that they will most certainly indeed question their own belief system. Of that I have no absolute doubt at all whatsoever. I am deadly serious about that, and I'm quite sincere. I wouldn't risk losing my credibility. Check it out, the property is still there in Cardiff Road in Bargoed. Google it. I have used real names as I have nothing to hide, and every detail I shared can be verified. Most of the people I mentioned above have now died, but those who are still with us still remember it and still talk of it. My mother and I wouldn't want to go through that again.
Well, a really long time ago I was working security. I was sent to fill in for somebody one night at this hospital, which was no longer a hospital. It was really only kept for filming, and security was hired basically to keep away squatters and vagrants and vandals and that. Trust me, I'm in love, girl, you do not have to turn your back very long to get either of them. In the big cities, it's just par for the course. So I showed up, and the guy that I was relieving showed me the ropes, told me what I had to do, and told me that there would be a guy as backup. This guy was welded to the seat in the lobby with a mini TV in his lap and earphones on his face, so he's pretty much deaf and blind to the world. He could have been a scarecrow in a uniform. So I'll just refer to him as Scarecrow from this point on. So I leave the lobby and start to patrol the building. Even though nothing was happening, there was a very eerie dead quiet about the place. And the appearance, it looked like something out of the Twilight Zone. I mean, it looked like maybe a minute ago it was a super busy hospital, and then everyone just disappeared because there were just books and file folders scattered about, the phones were off the hook, medical instruments scattered about. It reminded me more of like the Christian notion of the rapture. Like, snap, everyone's gone. That's exactly how it looked, and as I'm going through the walkways, some of the hallways had windows, and out of the corner of my eye, I would see, like, people, There is one old man in the hospital gown, and it looked like he had a monitor on wheels or an IV on wheels, I'm not sure which, and it looked like he was floating, I guess. It's because as he was passing through the hall, you didn't see a gate or any steps. I could only see from the torso up. The rest was blocked by the hallway. Aside from the scarecrow, I literally had the whole entire building to myself, and that happened a couple more times where I would see people peripherally, but whenever I turned to look at them, they always disappeared. There were the cold spots that would form. At first, it would be like a very small area, and then it would just spread out. I would say that this was like the late 90s when this happened.
I was in college in Austin. This was in the 80s. We had to find something to do that wasn't very expensive, that was fun. What my brother and I, got involved in was crewing for hot air balloons. During the spring, a lot of the pilots, you crew for different ones, if they needed it, and what would happen was, if you crewed and there was a spot on the balloon, and it was your turn, they would let you ride. The very first time I ever got to ride in a balloon, it was just northeast of Austin in Hutto. It's a very small community, and you could watch the balloons, and depending on which way the wind is blowing, you gotta get up very early, like about 4:30 in the morning, and you launch around 6:30 in the morning. And the pilot obviously has those paying customers, and you get these. There's a crew in a car that will follow the balloon. One will ask permission from a property owner to land the balloon, if you're gonna land on someone's property. Well, I got to go in the balloon. It was my first ride, and I was so excited. We lifted off, the sun was coming up. It was so beautiful. It was like riding in an elevator, your stomach kind of got that. Well, while we were coming to the end of our flight, we passed over this cemetery, and you can see the horizon, everything. And I noticed that they were like these kids. There was like 2 girls and a boy or 2 boys and a girl, I'm not really sure, but they're running through the cemetery and we're looking down, looking at it, and a few of us were mentioning, you know what, those kids have not been taught very good manners because they're running across the graves. I was always taught that you don't step on the actual grave. You know, you kind of go around the sides. And we started looking around and we were like, where are their parents? And then we're like, okay, there's no houses around here, we're out in the middle of nowhere. And I was like, did they have bicycles? There's no cars around. Who got them out there? We were getting ready to land and I can't remember this particular pilot's name, but she's radioing her crew and she's like, do you guys see a car or anything around there, down there, as you are coming up on the cemetery? And they replied back, nope. We were like, do you see these kids that are down there? And they are saying, no, there's no kids, there's not any kids or bikes, there's nothing over here. And that was pretty much the communication she had with the crew. And we land and they're coming up like. We immediately, all of us in that balloon, wanted to go back to that grave or that cemetery and look for these kids because we realized, what the heck did we just see? To this day, I still don't know whether they were really kids, but then they just disappeared right before we landed. Like, where did they go? And it's out in the middle of nowhere. It just gave me goosebumps and we were all just going, did you see that? Did you see that? Yes, I saw that. The one. I don't remember if it was 2 girls or 2 boys and a girl. I do remember one girl with long dark hair and she had a dress on, you know, like kids going with their parents to visit. It was said it was a weekend and I thought they were going to go visit, and, of course, kids don't want to stay with the parents, you know, when they're visiting someone. But, yeah, they were just running across and in between the tombstones. It was just, I don't know. We went back there and there was nobody out there. And it wasn't that big of a cemetery. At first we were going, where are their manners? Where are their manners? Then we were like, wait a minute, are there any cars? We're in a balloon, we can see everything for miles, and that was just weird.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.